we have with us Associate Professor Eben Kirksey, Professor of Anthropology at Deakin University and currently in residence at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton. He is well known to many people in the world of academia for his work on multi-species anthropology. He's published 2 books with Duke University Press, Emergent Ecologies and Freedom in Entangled Worlds. And his most recent book is coming out very soon, entitled The Mutant Project, Inside the Race to Genetically Modify Humans, that'll be published by St. Martin's Press. And just before he starts speaking, if you are enticed by the kind of conversations that we'll be having today, do check out the Multispecies Coronavirus Reading Group, which you can connect with on Facebook. There'll be the link on Twitter and also on the YouTube page that you might be watching right now. I've been joining on Saturday mornings, Australian time, Friday evenings in the US, and other times in other places in the world. And it's an incredibly exciting group to be part of and to think through together the current crisis. And Eben's talk today, entitled The Emergence of COVID-19, a Multi-Species Story, is inspired and produced by the collaborative thinking in that reading group. So I will hand over to Eben, who will present for around 35 minutes or so, and then we will go to a Q&A. So please put your questions in on the YouTube chat, or you can put them on Twitter, and we will work through them after the talk. Thank you, Eben.
Thanks so much for having me, Emma. And my talk really today builds on the brilliant conversation you started last week with Patricia Wald. So Patricia was telling us about her classic work on outbreak narratives and the consequences that these narratives have. Outbreak narratives disseminate information. They impact survival rates and contagion routes. And they also affect how people are stigmatized, how individuals are stigmatized, groups, populations, and even places. They change behaviors, lifestyles, and economies. And today I'm going to talk about how outbreak narratives also shape multi-species relationships. Animals that have been targeted in the past for mass slaughter in the name of protecting human health have very much been figuring into outbreak narratives lately. And in the past, we have also seen with disease outbreak narratives how whole landscapes have been sprayed with deadly toxins, things like DDT that have driven many species towards extinction. The whole modernist project, I argue, has alienated the human from the environment. And my talk today is situated in this broader conversation in multi-species studies and environmental humanities that is interested in the ways that our relationships with animals, plants, microbes, and fungi have been dramatically shaped and changed by the modern world system, the agricultural projects, the supply chains, and the transportation infrastructures that have come together under a particular form of global capitalism. So today I'm going to get inside of one of the main outbreak narratives circulating in the media about COVID-19, and I'm going to take that outbreak narrative and put it inside political, economic, historical, and ecological context. I'm going to also dive pretty deep into the scientific knowledge informing the narrative, where I'm going to take you into the realm of molecular biology, genetics, and genomics to reckon with what Isabel Stingers calls fact dishes. That is, these provisional bits of knowledge that get turned into fetish objects. Things that if you push too hard on them, they quickly break and fall apart. So in short, I'm going to distinguish fact from fiction, what is unknown from what is known about the coronavirus. And one thing that we do know about the coronavirus, or this whole broad group of viruses, is that they've been around for a long time, thousands of years, if not millions. And we have different strains of coronaviruses that infect a variety of mammals, from pigs to camels to even beluga whales, as well as a diversity of birds, from pigeons to chickens and pheasants. In part, the ability of these viruses to move among species illustrate a shared underlying biology. But in today's world, it also illustrates a shared vulnerability. So by way of background, for people who don't know my work, I'm a cultural anthropologist. And when I started out as an undergraduate, I was curious about nature and culture. But I was doing a degree in the 1990s during the science wars, where biologists and anthropologists were fiercely debating about how nature and nurture shape the human condition. 10 years ago, I published this article with Stefan Hamrick, The Emergence of Multispecies Ethnography. And for the past decade, there's been an explosion of work in this vein that uses the traditions of anthropology, continental philosophy, and the sociology of science to study how humans interact with other species. Collectively, this project is about the lives and deaths of other kinds of life that shape human social worlds, and also how our political, economic, and cultural systems impact other species like microbes. And also how these seemingly small, seemingly inconsequential, imperceptible forms of life can disrupt human ways of being in the world. And to be clear, today I'm not drawing on my own original field research or interviews. I think there's a lot of people out there who are proclaiming themselves as COVID experts. And as Emma said in the introduction, really my talk comes out of a collective project. It's a collective reading project, and basically in conversation with other experts in multi-species ethnography, the environmental humanities, I've been delving deep into the primary literature, the scientific literature, but also classic articles in science studies and philosophy and anthropology that might offer us a perspective on the current moment. So to really situate us in that outbreak narrative that I mentioned at the outset, I'm going to play a video from Vox that tells a multi-species story.
It was New Year's Eve 2019 when health officials in China admitted they had a problem.
Health authorities have activated the most serious response level after an outbreak of a new type of viral pneumonia
in central China.
A rapidly growing number of people were developing a dry cough and fever before getting pneumonia. And for some, it turned fatal. Doctors have named the disease COVID-19, coronavirus disease 2019, indicating that a type of virus is causing the illness. When they tried to trace its origin, they found a likely source: this food market in Wuhan. Out of the first 41 patients, 27 had been here. It wasn't conclusive evidence, but Chinese officials quickly shut down the market. They had seen this happen before at a place just like this.
Health officials are trying to get a grip on an alarming outbreak of SARS.
The virus originated in mainland China.
Has spread across the country.
The disease had been festering for months in southern China.
In 2002, a coronavirus had emerged at a very similar market in southern China. It eventually reached 29 countries and killed nearly 800 people. Now, 18 years later, this coronavirus is in at least 71 countries and has already killed over 3,100 people. So what do these markets have to do with the coronavirus outbreak, and why is it happening in China? A lot of the viruses that make us sick actually originate in animals. Some of the viruses that cause the flu come from birds and pigs. HIV/AIDS comes from chimpanzees. The deadly Ebola virus likely originates in bats. And in the case of the 2019 coronavirus, there's some evidence it went from a bat to a pangolin before infecting a human. While viruses are very good at jumping between species, it's rare for a deadly one to make this journey all the way to humans. That's because it would need all these hosts to encounter each other at some point. That's where the Wuhan market comes in. It's a wet market.
So I'm just going to push pause there and unpack and slow down and try to get at the evidential basis of some of these claims. Where did this idea about bats and pangolins come from? So the origin of the market story came from the Chinese government. On December 31st, 2019, the Chinese Health Commission of Wuhan announced that there had been a cluster of viral pneumonia cases in the city. some of which had been linked to the seafood market, which also sells live animals. A few days later, an article was published in Nature, and this article has been very influential in terms of how we think about COVID-19. This article first established a link between the original SARS outbreak that happened, almost 2 decades ago, and COVID-19. Now, the official taxonomic name of COVID-19 is SARS-CoV-2. This article that came out in Nature also established for the first time this connection between the bats and the public imagination. Basically, they sequenced the DNA of viruses that they found in bats and the ones that were in the people living in Wuhan, and found an 86% similarity to the 2 types of coronaviruses. But not so fast. If you look at genomes, you look at human genomes, for example, a 96% identity isn't a very close match after all. John Marks, a biological anthropologist, reminds us that humans are 98% chimpanzee on a genetic level. So the 2 viruses that they found, the one in bats and the one in people, were less similar to each other than humans are to chimpanzees. The following week, after that Nature article came out, the pangolin story started to circulate on February 7th with a press conference from Southern China Agricultural University. They reported in a paper that was later published in Nature that there was a coronavirus in pangolins that was even more closely related to COVID-19. But that particular story did not connect all the dots. The pangolins that they found were not from Wuhan, but they were connected to a smuggling ring in southern China. Pangolins are these scaly anteaters. They're endangered animals found in Africa and Southeast Asia, and they're used in Chinese medicine. But there was sort of this nebulous allegation that somehow this place in Guangzhou, these wet markets were somehow linked to this emergence of a new viral disease. With these publications in scientific journals, the speculation in the English language media went wild with stories about an exotic animal market deep in the Orient. Now you're all familiar with this story. These stories about the live animal market reek of Orientalism. Media pundits who've struggled to explain the sudden upheaval of the modern world have reanimated old stereotypes about Asian people and exotic animals. The subjects of these multi-species stories, to reference Edward Said, share in common an identity that is best described as lamentably alien. I'm gonna let the rest of this video play for a little bit.
A kind of place where live animals are slaughtered and sold for consumption.
It was not a surprise at all, and I think that it was not a surprise to many scientists.
Peter Lee is a professor and expert on China's animal trade.
The cages stacked up one over another. Animals at the bottom are often soaked with all kinds of liquid, animal excrement, pus, blood, or whatever the liquid received from animals above.
That's
Those are the kinds of bats, horseshoe bats. They're very cute. The pangolin. And now we're to Peter Lee. So Peter Lee is not an epidemiologist, nor is he an expert on zoonotic diseases. He's a political scientist who has a degree in foreign relations. And if you go on to watch the rest of that Vox video, there's some interesting things that emerges. Lee blames the patterns of consumption of the elite Chinese who drive the endangered species trade, basically arguing that it's not the populace of China as a whole, but the Chinese elite that's kind of driving the endangered species trade, and therefore creating the conditions of possibility for viral emergence. And he points to industrial farms and live animal markets as the site of dangerous multi-species encounters. And in short, he looks at a history promoted by the Communist Party that basically in a scheme to kind of bring people out of impoverished circumstances, wild animals were collected and caged together and raised in these very intense industrial circumstances. The story started to unravel at the same time it was coming together, and John Cohen, a journalist who writes for Science, was among the very first people to challenge the wet market outbreak narrative. On January 26th, Cohen suggested that the virus possibly spread silently between people in Wuhan and perhaps elsewhere before a cluster of cases from the city's now infamous Hunan seafood wholesale market was discovered. And at the seafood market, again, there were no bats that have been definitively found, no pangolins, just speculation. Exotic animals and people are mingling together. Some evidence for this counter-narrative is buried in the Lancet, a world-renowned medical journal. The team of Chinese physicians who studied the initial COVID-19 outbreak reported that the first cases, in fact, did not involve contact with exotic animals. The very first patient with the disease is someone who never visited the market, and they began experiencing symptoms on December 1st, 2019. And so, some of these initial patients, the timelines are getting revised these days, but we do know, from these very early cases, they weren't at this market. 9 days later, 2 other people who had no known contact with the market experienced the onset of symptoms. On that same day, on December 10th, that was when the first patient who visited the seafood market became sick. So this is where those fragile facts linking the origin of COVID-19 to bats and pangolins start to fall apart. This important article in Nature Medicine mounts evidence that no animal coronavirus has yet been identified that is sufficiently similar to have served as a direct progenitor of SARS-CoV-2. In short, it argues that it's a sampling error, that only a limited number of other coronaviruses and other animal species have thus far been sequenced by scientists. So we have a very fragmentary picture of the evolution of this organism. In short, scientists were looking for coronaviruses in exotic animals, and they found them. The pangolin paper that was published in Nature came up with a seemingly tidy evolutionary tree. So you see on the screen there, coronaviruses that were found in the Malaysian endangered pangolin right next to the human coronaviruses. But in the same paper, there's a really important line that gives a nod to the complexity lurking behind the seemingly simple multi-species story. This line suggests that this lineage of the coronavirus has experienced widespread recombination with genome fragments coming from multiple SARS-CoV-2 related lineages. So that sounds like a lot. I'm going to slow down and kind of unpack what that means. And to understand this really complicated, tangled genealogy of the COVID-19 virus, I turned to a classic paper by Stefan Hamrick, which we read a couple of weeks ago in the Multispecies reading group. In short, in this classic piece published by Hamrick in 2003, he found new facts about relationships amongst living species, mostly looking at microbes in marine environments. And these relationships were disturbing Darwin's idea about natural classification. He was interested in particular in lateral gene transfer amongst microbes, and looking at the ways that evidence about genes moving around were uprooting the very basis of what biologists call the tree of life. So instead of a tree with branches going out, you see more of a tangled bush. So such an argument is going to be familiar to anyone who's read Lynn Margulis's work, who argues that acquiring genomes is what makes many species come into the world. So here you see in this evolutionary tree, genes jumping from plants into fungi into bacteria. So things are not sitting still. When we get back to the COVID genome and really dig deep into different segments of the genome, we can see that it's not a single origin event, but multiple events where these recombination events are happening. So basically genes from different branches of this viral evolutionary bush, it's not a tree, are coming together. So how does all this work? On a molecular level, basically all animal cells look very similar. We have cell membranes, and then on the outside of these cell membranes, we have receptors. And to get inside of a cell, a virus usually locks up with that receptor, and then it goes inside. So if you have an example like on the left, so the right-hand part of the slide illustrates how the receptor gets in, binding to the receptor. On the left, you see two viruses together in the same cell. And that's how these recombination events work. Viral reproduction depends on cellular machinery of its host, and things can get really messy. Big chunks of DNA can move around. I'm going to show another video, and I want you to view this video, which is about human cells, in the context of thinking about the possibility of these moments where viruses come together. So this is about the coronavirus, but I want you to imagine as you're tracking this virus through the cell and through the cellular machinery, imagine that there's a couple of different viruses in there.
Researchers from China have used cryo-electron microscopy to show how SARS-CoV-2 infects humans. The study published in Science says the virus targets a type of receptor found on human cells in the lungs, heart, kidneys, and intestines. Citing Kingston University microbiologist Mark Fielder, Sky News reports that the virus seems to attack two types of lung cells: goblet cells that coat the respiratory tract with mucus, and ciliated cells that usually filter out pathogens. A previous study published in Science found the virus spike protein has two receptor binding domains, or RBDs, facing downward and another facing upward. These allow the virus to bind with and invade human cells. The virus targets a human ACE2 receptor that has bonded with an amino acid transporter. This subtype of ACE2 structure has never been discovered before. The virus uses the spike protein's up RBD to penetrate the cell. The virus then dissolves its own protein shell and releases its RNA payload inside the cell, according to British Society for Immunology. A study in Frontiers in Microbiology says a coronavirus hijacks the cell structure to reproduce. The viral RNA takes over the host cell's endoplasmic reticulum to replicate itself and to manufacture the protein parts to make new viruses. According to the Society for Immunology, the hijacked cell's Golgi bodies then package viral RNA and proteins in a viral protein shell. This leads to the creation of new viruses that leave the infected cell via the membrane. The study in Frontiers in Microbiology says coronavirus takeover imposes stress on the host cell. Cell death, or apoptosis, is the result when the infection overwhelms the host cell's ability to maintain homeostasis.
So next week in the Coronavirus Multispecies Reading Group, we're going to be reading a paper by John Dupre and Stefan Hamrick that argues that viruses should be seen as processes rather than things or substances. In their words, a virus is a process that can often mix with and become part of other processes and hence contribute to a number of outcomes at the same time. Other animals like pigs and chickens have in the past been studied as processes of viral mixing. A given organism, a human or an animal, again, if it's infected by multiple viruses, these recombination events can occur with the swap of genetic information. So at this point, we actually don't know, did this novel coronavirus emerge in a human cell? Did it emerge in an animal cell? What we do have evidence for is multiple recombination events. So in thinking about the possibilities of this virus jumping across species, the key thing to draw out of that video is it mentioned the ACE2 receptor, which is pictured here on the cover of Science. This is the receptor that lets the virus get in. The spike protein binds to ACE2. And based on studies of the structure, the function, the morphology of this receptor, we can speculate about other species that might be vulnerable to this particular version of SARS-CoV-2. So some initial studies suggested that in addition to humans, ferrets and cats have ACE2 receptors that look really similar. So this is an extensive list of ACE2 receptor sequences. What we have here is a list of the amino acids that go into building this receptor. And some things from this list are not surprising. You see that basically chimps and macaques, primates that share a lot of evolutionary history with humans, have ACE2 receptors that are very similar to people. You see other somewhat surprising things. Cats are the next closest animal to us, at least if you're just looking at the similarities of the structure of the ACE2 receptor. But very surprisingly, other animals like cattle, sheep, horses, camels, and foxes might also be vulnerable. They have ACE2 receptors that are very much like ours. So again, rather than a single moment of origin, what we're seeing is evidence of this moving amongst multiple species, that these recombination events could have happened several different times in the recent history of this virus. Now many leading microbiologists are looking into the possibility of these many prior zoonotic events where coronaviruses were passed back and forth between humans and multiple other animal species. So how should we make sense of all this complexity? With this multi-species story, I'm getting a lot of help from Celia Lowe, whose paper on viral clouds was published in 2010 alongside the original essay about the emergence of multi-species ethnography. She describes avian influenza H5N1 as a cloud of particles, uncertain ontologies, multiplying narratives, and apocalyptic dreams. So today, I'm building on Lowe's ideas to think about how viruses live in ecological communities, how viruses are transformed as they interact with the immune systems and receptors of animal hosts, but also with human institutions, infrastructures, and behaviors that facilitate their spread. Building on Lowe's ideas, I suggest that we might understand COVID-19 as a multi-species assemblage. The notion of assemblage foregrounds the interaction of political, economic, and ecological forces that come together to shape emergent forms of life. I suggest that novel pandemic strains of coronavirus assemble themselves with a series of small mutation events, as well as recombination of larger chunks of DNA, plus interactions with other forms of life on macro and molecular scales. My ideas about multi-species assemblages are closely related to Celia Lowe's thoughts on multi-species clouds, or what she describes as collections of species that transform together in both ordinary and surprising ways. Clouds, she says, are material features of viral epidemiologies. There's viral particles, droplets, and spittle, water, that form a rain, and humidity that's floating all around us. But she's also trying to describe the cloudy thinking, what she describes as a cloudy epistemological haze that emerges often with viral outbreaks. With influenza 10 years ago, she was looking at how social and biological forms emerged together as people were thinking about future possibilities. That pandemic, that influenza pandemic that people were terrified about never happened, but they were still speculating, and the viral clouds in those days already rearranged species, people, and institutions, as well as nations, remaking biological and political relationships all along the way. Cloudy thinking still prevails as public health officials in some jurisdictions try to further alienate people from the environment. And here you have a picture of health workers in mainland China spraying a toxic gas that has killed off a wide diversity of species. And to be very clear, killing and culling of other species is not what I'm advocating today. For me, the idea of a multi-species assemblage offers an important antidote to cloudy thinking. Anna Singh writes about ecological assemblages in Mushroom at the End of a World. Thinking through assemblage urges us to ask, how do gatherings sometimes become happenings, Singh says, that is greater than the sum of their parts. Rather than form an assemblage because they're a certain type, Singh is interested in, she's looking at oaks, pines, and mushrooms, and how they become involved with each other in an assemblage. To learn about an assemblage, one unravels its knots. In my story about COVID-19 multi-species assemblages, it is important to ask who or what is doing the assembling. I showed you a video of organelles in human cells, the endoplasmic reticulum and the Golgi apparatus. These are the organelles that are assembling coronavirus particles. Certainly on a molecular level, human cells continue to do assembly work, building these quasi-living forms, these processes with the potential to jump from cell to cell, from body to body, from species to species. This is a story of molecular assemblages and processes. Jumping scale, we must think about other human economic systems and processes, like industrial farming, when thinking about the assembly of COVID-19. We shouldn't just be sampling coronavirus populations and exotic animals like pangolins, bats, civets, and raccoon dogs. We urgently need better science, science that is able to account for political and economic systems, how these economic and political systems become agential forces that shape the emergence of deadly diseases. With industrialized farms, we have the proximity of thousands, sometimes hundreds of thousands of genetically similar animals, and this has contributed, it's been documented, to previous viral emergences like H1N1 influenza. Hogs on farms in China have tested positive for SARS, the close cousin of COVID-19. And here in the United States, pork facilities have become home to earlier coronavirus outbreaks. The emergence of COVID-19 is thus a story, again, of industrial assemblages and processes. To borrow the words of Antonio Benitez Rojo, this is a story of intensive and extensive cultivation, of quality and quantity, national and foreign capital, cosmopolitanism, independence and dependence, agricultural and industrial diversification alongside monocultural, monoproduction, sovereignty and intervention, the discourse of power and the discourse of resistance, desire and repression, the revolutionary and the reactionary, coexistence and violence. I also want to give a shout out to a new book that has emerged on the factory farming of pig, Porkopolis by Alex Blanchette. Alex also has a piece on the outbreak of pig coronaviruses that we read again in that same reading group a couple of weeks ago. The story of assembling COVID-19 is also about precarious labor, and Alex tells us all about the precarious labor and meat packing industries. And this precarious labor comes with unequally shared vulnerability to viral exposures. It is a story of a world where social isolation is a privilege. To be clear, people have driven this global pandemic, not animals. My story about assembling COVID-19 is one of elite privilege and asymmetries of responsibility. Power inequalities have generated this outbreak. Only some of us in this world have the freedom to travel. As a global elite accumulated capital by assembling bodies of people and multiple other species into systems of industrial production, asymmetries of vulnerability were built into the modern world system. Species multiples assembled within our commodity chains, within our transportation infrastructures, amidst our patterns of mobility, settlement, and agriculture. Anna Singh again asks us to think about ecological assemblages as gatherings that sometimes become happenings. In thinking about COVID-19 as a multi-species assemblage, I'm naming something much more than a happening. We have participated in assembling a pandemic that took off along lines of flight, deterritorializing and reterritorializing in transportation infrastructures, as bodies in space had fleeting encounters. This viral process has become an unpredictable emergent force with the power to remake the world in ways that were previously unimaginable. COVID-19 has generated the conditions of possibility for reconfiguring flows of capital and of people. Airplanes have been grounded, the price of oil has plummeted, even taking on a negative economic value. The virus has shown us the limits of agency of anthropos, the ethical and reasoning being that has been conjured as our inheritance from ancient Greece. COVID-19 has brought an end to the Anthropocene. This multi-species assemblage has produced a profound shift, again, in these industrial processes and capitalist ontologies. Consequential transformations have already taken place to the global economy and planetary ecologies. We now have an opportunity to create new relational ethics, to act as if everything matters. We've entered a global slowdown, a time to contemplate the world as it was, as it is, as it might be. New relationships and responsibilities have emerged with the novel coronavirus. We now live with a shared sense of vulnerability. Ideas about immunity and community are shifting. Anxiety about animals is spreading. Some of our pets might be just as vulnerable to the virus as our intimate human companions. Again, now is not the time for mass culling or killing. Instead, we have an opportunity to renew our ethical commitments and co-create shared spaces of refuge. Now is also a time to care for our more distant animal kin, who are probably not vulnerable to the virus, who have a different biological makeup, whose ACE2 receptors do not look like our own. But still, many of these animals, insects, other kinds of invertebrates, are still vulnerable. They're being killed by these same agricultural and industrial and global transportation technologies that have enabled the emergence of the coronavirus. We now have an opportunity to co-create a world after the Anthropocene, a lively alternative to the world before the emergence of COVID-19. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Eben. That was beautiful, and the ability to cover so many scales, from the intracellular to the global to the planetary, is always such a beautiful aspect of your work. So the questions will start to come through, but we're on a slight delay to the YouTube cast. So I want to start. I had, a bunch of questions as you were talking, but something you said towards the end, that we are at the end of the Anthropocene. I can't let that go by without some more elaboration. So, I mean, some could say what you have described is the essence of the Anthropocene, that the Anthropocene is humans fashioning the world in a way that is focused on short-term profit, but we are assembling our own destruction through the Anthropocene. And climate change has been linked for many years with the increased risk of emerging pandemics. So are you actually making argument that the Anthropocene is over, or maybe it's a more hopeful shift towards a call to end the Anthropocene rather than a diagnosis?
So it is a diagnosis. So for me, the emergence of this microbe shows how easily the reach of human agency and action can, collapse, right? So, this understudied form of life was relatively unknown. Like, most of us have probably had coronaviruses in the last couple of years. Like, the common cold is a coronavirus. Like, I've felt crummy a number of times in the last couple of years, probably from a coronavirus. But here we have the emergence of a viral agent that suddenly brings capitalism to a halt, that brings the human capacity to reason, to make rational calculations, to a limit where there's breaks. And for me, the Anthropocene discourse has always struck me as anthropocentric, as something that scales up human agency and action to embrace and endanger the whole planet. And arguably, our agency is mediated by many others. Zoe Todd tells us how the undead from the Pleistocene that become oil, petrochemical capitalism is fueled by the bodies of these extinct animals. Our agencies have been mediated and multiplied by multiple others. And, there's many previous moments in the world's history where a form of life has endangered planetary ecologies. The so-called oxygen holocaust, when microbes first learned how to do this new metabolic process that produced this waste product, oxygen, which was highly toxic to pretty much almost every form of life that had existed at the time. But still, up until now, no one has proposed naming a geological era after an organism. And the Anthropocene was never accepted. It was never accepted, like, you know, there's not a consensus amongst the erudite, probably old white men who make the decision about, you know, naming geological eras. So maybe the Anthropocene has never begun, but for me, this moment, it is a diagnostic claim. It's saying, you know, if we had the hubris to imagine that we could control the world, we're being brought to our knees by a microbe that we barely understand. And it really just shows the limits of human knowledge and the limits of our technologies and the limits of our science. And, you know, we're having to come up with all these improvisational social and technological and infrastructural fixes to this organism that we're still just barely starting to understand.
Yeah, well, I suppose just a little a short response is that, I mean, another argument, and coming from Indigenous studies, is that, you know, climate change, the Anthropocene, is something that has already been experienced by Indigenous groups who've had their worlds taken apart. And of course, the Anthropocene, global capitalism, has been the end of flourishing of so many groups. So it's more the upscaling so that the privileged are now confined, affected in ways that they're not used to. So I suppose if that's a question of scale, I'm not sure how that affects your argument that it's the end of the Anthropocene.
Yeah, and I think it's also a question of geopolitics. So one of the places where I do work, West Papua, where I've been doing work for over 20 years, there's many endemic diseases there. You know, malaria, dengue, polio, cholera. You know, the reasons that Black Indigenous people continue to die in West Papua are not technological reasons, they're geopolitical reasons. So, you know, the Anthropocene discourse also homogenizes the human. And we've got lots of other nuanced ways of talking about the current moment. You know, the plantationist scene, the capitalist scene. We're living through a lot of different scenes. And yeah, there's you know, the distribution of agency and power and capital and responsibility is unequal in the current moment and, you know, the previous moment, and lived experiences of genocide by Indigenous communities, I think is a different way of throwing some darts into this big balloon of the Anthropocene and deflating it.
Yeah, great. So we've got two questions lined up. The first is from Matt Barlow, who's at the University of Adelaide, who asks if we have any thoughts or ideas of how we translate a relational multi-species ontology into the kind of democracy that we want to see beyond the academy. So just a small question there, I suppose, expanding on your new relational ethics.
Yeah, for me, that word democracy invokes sort of a Latourian genealogy. You know, Latour talks about his parliament where people who speak on behalf of other people, politicians, come together with scientists, people who speak on behalf of nature, and kind of come together to reconcile the world and come with a just resolution. For me, that kind of representational politics is the wrong way to go. And a relational ethics and a relational ontology that I'm trying to describe and work towards is about replacing that Latourian model with maybe a Baradian ontoepistemology, where being and knowing are entangled in relations with other forms of life. And what does that look like in actual practice? That looks like maybe engaging in what Heather Paxson calls microbiopolitics. So these circuits of matter and meaning that kind of evade the dominant forms. You know, she describes making raw milk cheeses in the face of a national policy that makes it very difficult for dairy farmers to do anything but just pasteurize and sterilize all their milk. You know, what other sorts of local networks of knowing and being can we create, can we foster, can we care for, can we nourish? Like when I'm thinking about shared spaces of refuge along with Donna Haraway, I'm thinking about, you know, how to cultivate these spaces of community and immunity, how to you know, take very seriously the possibility that a virus could disrupt my lived world, or the prospect of a toxic pollutant, or there's all sorts of other agential forces that have disruptive potential in these kinds of relatings. So yeah, I guess I would sidestep that question, push back against democracy, and celebrate the kinds of multi-species relations that might subvert or go lateral or rhizomal with respect to these dominant institutions and structures of power and you know, factory farms and assembly lines that bring us the stuff that we eat and consume.
Yeah. We have a question from Natasha Finn, who's asking about the alternative origin stories to the wet market stories, and what do these alternative hypotheses relating to industrial assemblages, how do they change the story, the narrative?
So I think they changed the story in terms of responsibility and relational ethics. So you know, if this is a story of the Oriental other that is too close to animals, that has improper modes of biosociality, you know, this becomes part of this racialized discourse that fuels antagonistic national politics, that fuels all sorts of geopolitical battles that are not helpful in the current moment. If the story of origins, maybe it has to do with industrial capitalism, maybe it doesn't. Maybe it's just about contingencies of, you know, the viral mixing bowl could well have been a human cell. You know, it could have been just a series of contingent encounters that isn't about these market dynamics. I think the conditions of possibility for a global pandemic emergence have less to do with agriculture, but more with airlines and transportation and people like me who travel way too much and who also share a disproportionate responsibility for global climate emissions. So I think it's not, you know, pinpointing any single thing, but looking at these multiple parallel processes that are producing the conditions of possibility, not only of emergence, but also spread.
Yeah, so this follows on nicely to the next question from Radhika Guru, who asks, who is it that gets to be we in this assemblage of a new relational ethic? So it's really, I suppose, a question of agency. And it also occurred to me, you know, hearing you talk about the virus, like what kind of agent is the virus in all this? Yeah, and I suppose also going back to democracy, if we have to do away with the concept of democracy, maybe replacing it with something like care or flourishing, then what kind of agents are assembling this?
So in thinking about pronouns, I love to think in Indonesian, which is one of my other languages. So in Indonesian, there's two versions of we. There's the inclusive we, which is like kita, that's all of us. So including everyone who's within realm of address. And kami is an exclusive we. It's just, you know, me and Emma, but not all the rest of y'all. Y'all is also a great word for we too. It's one that we have here in the US. But yeah, I mean, I think about, you know, both the kami form of we and the kita form of we in this emergent symbiotic moment. You know, Donna Haraway describes in The Promises of Monsters the symbiotic relationships that were enabled during the HIV epidemic, symbiotic relationships amongst people and viruses and pharmaceutical companies and lawyers and politicians. And, you know, the we in those networks was constantly shifting. The dance of enemy and ally you know, on a given day, you know, you could have an antagonistic politics of protest oriented towards a drug company, or oriented towards a researcher, or oriented towards a politician. But then that boundary of enemy and ally shifts, and the we becomes more inclusive. So I don't think it's possible to say, like, you know, in any kind of ever expansive way, like, you know, like, we're all in this together. Like, I think this, like, kind of kumbaya moment erases the structural inequalities that are inherent in, you know, the agrarian assemblages that our lives are entangled with, the carceral geographies that our lives are entangled with, you know, the unequal vulnerabilities. So I think in English, the word we is incredibly impoverished, and I would like to think about a more shifting dance between the kita and the kami forms of we, as I understand them in the Indonesian idiom.
Thank you. We have a question from Alexander Stingle about origins, which was, you know, really, I suppose, framed the talk you gave today. So what is, outside what we can learn from patient zero medically, so if we, and I think we are way beyond patient zero now in terms of trying to contain the outbreak through identifying patient zero and their contacts and so on, why are we all obsessed, or why are humans obsessed with these origin stories? Well, really, and you know, if I had more time, I'd have gone into Foucault a little bit, and sort of, you know, I joined Foucault saying, you know, it's not worth searching for an origin, but it's worth thinking about the conditions of emergence. And Foucault and Nietzsche talk about the emergence of forms of life or new forms of power within cracks of the dominant architectures. And, you know, really what I was trying to do today is very much disrupt an origin story and say a single origin is never going to be found with the coronavirus. We're tracing multiple viral genealogies that are never going to resolve themselves into a concrete emergence. I think if you look at those tangled, so that one slide which had that tangled mess of competing evolutionary trees with different segments of the viral genome, clearly show to me, like, there isn't an origin, there's an emergence, and there's an emergence of multiple forms. We just happen to know and be impacted, and you know, like this one form that we learned a lot about, you know, the polycystic cleavage base site that lets the current form of COVID-19 be more infectious than SARS ever was, from a conversation with Christian Anderson last Friday. And, you know, there's lots of other parallel forms of kindred coronaviruses out there that are existing alongside this one. So, you know, any narrowing to a single origin, I think, is a wrong-headed project, but thinking about the conditions of possibility for emergence on all these different scales that I was trying to give simultaneously, like that's the project that I think is important. Yeah, and I felt it was such a great conversation, as they all are, but the one last Saturday, or your Friday, with Christian Anderson was quite amazing. And one of the things that I really took from that was that the conditions, this is referring to the, you know, ongoing news cycle about the Wuhan Virological Institute and whether they were the source of the virus, either from kind of, again, this Orientalist discourse of Chinese bad science or incompetent science. And I think people know that that's, you know, ridiculous in the case of this particular institute, which is extremely well regarded globally. But this kind of coincidence of it came from Wuhan, the virus, the Virological Institute is there. And what Christian was able to clarify was that the ecological conditions in Wuhan are such that these viruses are more likely to emerge, which is why the Institute is there. So it's the ecological conditions that are kind of the common deterministic factor for why the Institute is there and why why the virus emerged there.
And where we know about it, you know, it might well have emerged somewhere else simultaneously, and we only know about it from Wuhan because of that sampling question. You know, we had experts kind of on the scene doing the sequencing work, doing, you know, the bioinformatics work. So quite likely this is emerging in parallel.
Yeah, because it's in some ways the Institute is a sentinel to look forward to look ahead towards Frederick Keck, who will be reading in the reading group and will also be part of this seminar series. So one of the things that really struck me from the videos that you showed was this phrase in the first one from a news reader saying the disease was festering for months. And I was interested in this idea of festering, and it's both got these Orientalist ideas of, I'm sure there's a whole plethora of racist ideas of Asian people and festering that I, you know, would only need to Google search and look at some literature, academic literature to see. But it also is not, you know, not so different to your account of these multi-species, interspecies transmissions of different diseases, of different coronaviruses that eventually kind of form this super virus, as we've learned. It's incredibly effective at its job. So yeah, what does festering say to you?
Yeah, so I think last week Patricia Wald reminded us that metaphors are incredibly important, and at the same time we can't escape them, right? So all the words that I've been speaking today, those graphic illustrations, you know, those are not the thing itself. It's pointing at the thing, and you know, there's all kinds of ways to think about the relationship of language, the relationship of art, of illustrations to reality. But I think being responsible in our figuration, being responsible and attentive to the ways that language shapes, you know, our sentiments about each other, our sentiments about other animals, but also our orientations toward shared, you know, responsibilities. And, you know, if the responsibility and the place of origin is always elsewhere and you're not implicated, you know, that absolves you of a responsibility. The account that I was trying to give today is one of these relational ethics on a global scale. Like how are my patterns of travel in airports entangled with the emergence of this viral pandemic? You know, how is the food on my table tonight? You know, some of which that I got through local ecologies, but you know, I had bread, I had rice. You know, I do not have the capacity to grow this, and you know, these global assemblages and entanglements in many ways are inescapable. But I think we're at a moment where we're seeing essential workers who don't necessarily have access to medical care, to the stimulus checks in this country. So how do we think, rather than, you know, this festering site of origin, this exotic place where untoward encounters are happening, but let's think about our encounters in the world and how we might become responsible living within assemblages that are, in some cases, are inescapable, or maybe we do want to try to escape them and imagine ways of life that are outside of these dominant flows of people and power.
We've got a couple of questions from Twitter. The first is from a post-natural history handle, I should say. So they ask, is the bias towards domesticated species in the list of organisms with similar ACE2 receptors? So you talked about cattle and cats, for example, as having very similar ACE2 receptors as humans, and therefore potentially vulnerable and potentially a transmitter of the virus to humans. So is this list the result of domesticated genomes being more prevalent in the search? So like you said, if you look in exotic animals, you'll find it. Where you look, you'll find it. And then the narrative builds from that. And from a scientific point of view, we'd say that's biased. Or is it an artifact of increased viral sharing between companion and domesticated species?
I would actually say it's a third kind of artifact. I think it's an artifact of proximity and histories of science, where animals that are useful to us, animals that we like, animals that we keep close at hand are relatively well studied, and others aren't. So I think at the same time, and the bat story does have a longer genealogy than the present outbreak. After SARS, the wet market, the live animal market story was the origin story then, and in the subsequent decades, we've seen an intensification of research around bat coronaviruses and civet coronaviruses and raccoon coronaviruses. I think those earlier outbreak narratives connected to a live animal market were perhaps better substantiated than the current ones, although I haven't looked into the SARS case very well at all. But I think, if you go back to that list of ACE2 receptors, for starters, I should have said that there's some fuzzy thinking embedded in that table. All the animals are not the same. You have species designations on there, like the horseshoe bat, or I think it's actually the Rufous horseshoe bat, and I can't remember the exact genus species, but then you also have pangolins on there as an English language common name. There's actually at least 2 different kinds of pangolins, one from Malaysia, another from Africa.
8 species.
So we 8 species, look at that. So what kind of slippage and fuzzy thinking is embedded in that table? But yeah, I think there's a lot of, anytime you go out into the world, you're sampling and leaving artifacts and making decisions, consequential agential cuts, and you're leaving certain things unknown and making others knowable. And this is, I think, the job of scholars in science and technology studies, multi-species ethnographers, to establish critical friendships with scientists, to get to know their epistemologies and ontologies and apparatuses of knowing, but also show where their shortcomings and try to own the incompleteness of their factishes and push at them until they break and help them reform in new ways. So yeah, by no means do I think that list of ACE2 receptors is any kind of definitive diagnosis of other kinds of animals to watch out for or to care for better, but it's maybe a moment of detour from the exotic animal market to point towards more expansive ways of doing science to account for this current pandemic.
So we've got a question, another question from Twitter about the speculations about the effect of temperature and humidity on the spread of the virus. And I suppose I would point to these hopes in the Northern Hemisphere that things are going to get better over summer, and concerns, and then will potentially get worse in the winter at the end of the calendar year. But also, I think related to that is that the bats were in hibernation during the time of the outbreak in Wuhan. So that and other kind of relationships with temperature and atmospheric conditions. So I'm not sure if you got something to say about that.
It's honestly not something I know much about. I mean, yeah, we are living in a moment of climate change, global warming, and undoubtedly, this is shifting patterns of hibernation, of multi-species sociality, zoonotic transfer. But I don't think there's any kind of simple relationship. And from for that, questions about temperature, all I've heard are media accounts and journalist accounts. The one program that I did here suggested that we shouldn't be too hopeful about the pandemic disappearing in Northern Hemisphere summer.
Yeah. So I was interested to talk more about how the idea of assembly, and how, I suppose, returning to the idea of the end of the Anthropocene, that maybe another way to think through that is that we are now being assembled by the virus. And you mentioned that Alex Blanchett, his great book Porkopolis. Is that right? Porkopolis.
Yeah.
And we had the great pleasure of speaking to Alex at one of the reading groups, and he describes how the industrial workers on the pig farms have to, their movements are determined by the different companies they work for, because the companies don't want the viruses from the pigs in different facilities to mix. So they actually make the employees, people who live together can only work for one family so that the viruses don't mix. And we were reflecting how now all of us, most of the world, are now being assembled by the coronavirus. So how is that, does that link to your argument about the end of the Anthropocene?
Yeah, so for starters, I've always found the concept of assemblage, at least as it appears in De Lesenguatari, hard to pin down. And in preparing this talk and getting inside of these cells and just like trying to think, like, how is a virus made? Like, what's the co-production at work within the cell? Like, I started to get this very literal figuration of assembly, and then like scaling that up to think about industrial machinery and processes and flight patterns as agential forces of assembly. Yeah, I think we are being disassembled and reassembled by the virus, and the other kind of paper that I'm leaning on here and set of works is Karis Thompson's really amazing stuff on ontological choreography. So in her classic paper about assisted reproductive technologies, she coins this phrase, ontological choreography. And if you read it quickly, you think that it's kind of the doctors that are choreographing the show, but it's really the distributed agencies that are coming together to make people and technologies kind of assemble together in the production of a human child. And yeah, you know, the virus is making us move in certain ways, but only in conjunction with decrees from, you know, public health officials and social media, you know, like warnings on Facebook, and distributed regimes of Foucauldian surveillance where you're watching yourself and you're watching the other and turning the other and yourself into new sorts of biopolitical subjects, like new, you know, it's not like anyone, like at least here in the States, it sounds like it's maybe a little more invasive in Australia, but, you know, nobody's showing up at my door telling me to stay away from other people, but, you know, I've kind of internalized this. And it's not directly the virus. Like, you could imagine this virus out there in the world, and, you know, if you just compare death counts, like, yeah, heart disease is killing a lot of people. Cancer is killing a lot of people. There's a lot of other ongoing mortality events that are on the same level as this. But in addition to the viral contagion, the ways that particles are infecting bodies, at least some bodies, there's an affective contagion. There's kind of a collective anxiety, a collective sense of vulnerability and precarity. So it's not just the virus assembling us. Like, you know, there's all these distributed agencies that are choreographing these new ontologies to, again, dialogue with Karis.
Yeah, so there's clouds of agency, going back to Celia Lowe. Yeah, so I mean, for some people, this assembling of humans, or this self-discipline that we have, and in Australia, absolutely, there's people who've been fined, and in many countries, and I think in Europe as well, fined and arrested for disregarding quarantine rules. And we also have, of course, in Australia and a number of other countries, a tracing app that over 4 million people here have already downloaded. So many would see this kind of cloud as very much an extension of government control, and are very concerned about civil liberties and so on. Yeah, so how this is a much more kind of heavy-handed idea of agency that we're seeing. Yeah, what do you think about that?
Well, here I'm really excited about Tim Choi and Jerry Z's work on conspiracy. So they trace the root of conspiracy, which is bringing together. So at an earlier moment in history before the internet, they were thinking about the political work of breathing together. Like, we're all breathing together in different kinds of atmospheric conditions. And, you know, they were thinking about this in relation to particulate matter, in relation to chemical pollutants. But what are the new politics of conspiracy? Like, now that, you know, we're all, most of us like are conspiring with somebody now, or some buddies. Like, you know, there's a few of us who are extremely social, like just total social isolation, but most of us have settled into conspiratorial associations with at least a couple other people and maybe a few animals thrown in. But conspiracies are also moving online. So at the same time, like, I'm deeply distrustful. Like, I'm not going to even engage. And Celia Lowe is actually working on a great new paper about COVID conspiracy theories, not only the Wuhan, you know, release, but, you know, the counter allegations that like US soldiers dropped off on Wuhan on some training exercise. And then, you know, there's other kind of like eco-fascist conspiracy theory kind of things. But I think, to return to Tim Choi and Jerry Z, to think about the emergent politics of breathing together, but also ways of creating these links, these networks, these rhizomes, whatever, you know, there's something about the physicality though of breathing together that Z and Choi really nail. So those conspiratorial practices are being curtailed in some ways, but also intensifying, you know, like, you're holed up with your pandemic buddies and, you know, that's your posse. So I guess, like, in the face of these new modes of surveillance, I think we need a new politics of conspiracy.
Yes, yeah, well, from New Zealand, we have the idea of the bubble, which I know you've written about bubbles before in a different context, so you might be interested to think about the idea of the bubble. And we're actually, you know, I think probably as we speak, the Prime Minister of New Zealand, who we all love and desire for to have as everyone's Prime Minister, she's speaking to the National Cabinet in Australia to talk about extending the New Zealand bubble to Australia, so it can be like a trans-Tasman bubble. The Tim Choi's conspiracy, as in breathing together, so kind of taking the idea of conspiracy and thinking of con as in with, spire as in breathing, and I think that's really great idea to think this with. But of course, we are not allowed to breathe. We're trying to avoid breathing each other's. What was that word that Trudeau used? Speaking moistly. Little meme. And as we learned from Christian Andersen, and you know, I'm sure it's widely in the scientific literature that the coronavirus likes to live in the nose and the mouth, and is actually partly why it's so infectious, is because just speaking, it's not even coughing, but speaking can transmit it. So and based in Australia, many of us have masks, as I do, left over from our summer of having the kind of smoke pollution that most people have never experienced in Australia, and we got used to the outside, the atmosphere being something to protect ourselves from. So yeah, I suppose my follow-up would just be about the bubble and masks, and how breathing together has, you know, precisely become something that makes us vulnerable.
Yeah, the politics of breathing has radically shifted, and you know, here it's we're reading a paper by Melchan. A special, and there's a special issue of Monsters Quarterly called Viral that came out about 10 years ago. And Melchan has an excellent piece in there about the mask. And yeah, there's all sorts of ways that veiling and masks has an association with you know, kind of criminality and illicit subjects, but now, and there's also, you know, over the last 2 decades, you know, when there were earlier viral emergences that could have become pandemics, when practices of masking became naturalized in parts of East Asia, you've seen a real othering, like that figures into Orientalist discourse about, you know, those people over there. But now, yeah, we're becoming masked, and yeah, what does that mean now that we're breathing together apart in these masks?
Yeah. So we have a question from Cam McKean, one of your amazing PhD students, who is asking about the idea of life. So he's referencing Hamrick, who writes about the way that life becomes life. And we have here with the virus something that is not actually living under most definitions of the term. Disputable, that's right. Its status as a living object or organism is debatable. So yeah, what can we learn about this, about what life is?
So I would recommend for Cameron to join the reading group in 2 weeks when we're talking to John Dupre, who makes a forceful argument that viruses in fact are alive, that they're a process. And yeah, I think yeah, these processes, to stick with the Dupre terminology, are, you know, embedded in these architectures of assembly. It's a bigger conversation. We probably don't have time to unravel it here at the moment, but John Dupre is very articulate on that particular question, much more so than me. And
probably widely shows that the idea of life is a construction with its opportunities and limits. And I suppose Melchan's work on animacy and inanimacy is another work to think about, and Indigenous scholarship about ontologies and what is not a living organism. So Alex Burton asks through the YouTube page, what might be the long-term cultural impacts of the pandemic? And thinking back to things like the Spanish flu and the impacts that had, and I know that you're not a historian and neither am I, but I suppose it's maybe asking a little bit of a micro version of this wide relational ethics. Like, what are the concrete little pieces of cultural impacts that might lead us down different paths? And I suppose like social distancing is certainly one, whether we become habituated to social distance and to washing our hands, or maybe we appreciate the end of social distancing. We appreciate connection in a new way. Yeah, what do you think about that?
So I think the long-term cultural products are going to be heterogeneous and multiple, just like these viral ontologies. And one thing that has been remarkable, at least amongst people that I've been bumping into virtually here in the United States, is a resurgence of other kinds of microbial cultures. So, you know, this word culture is very polyvalent, and there's a whole book that kind of indexes, you know, it's an older book now that indexes all the different meanings of culture, but one that has particular currency in multi-species studies is looking at these microbial ferments and ecologies, not only in the microbiopolitical networks of Heather Paxson, but a whole lively crew that just gathered. We had a symposium, you know, in the days when travel was possible, at a castle in Portugal with Winter Grin about the cultures of fermentation. And so yeah, like imagining ways. So I guess I situate like this emergent affinity for, you know, kombucha and sauerkraut and kimchi and all these other things within a broader set of affinities towards life. And I guess this kind of goes back to Cameron's question, right? You know, we're at a moment, we're at kind of a crossroads. You know, do we further alienate from nature with a capital N, or do we think carefully and critically about possible multi-species assemblages that might flourish alongside this global pandemic assemblage? And yeah, what do those cultures look like? You know, so we can lean into life. We can affirm life. We can be biophilic rather than biophobic. And I think that's what's happening. You know, people who are baking sourdough bread, people who are learning how to live with microbes, and to get past these idioms of enemy ally, the dominant political discourse about warfare against the microbe. We read recently Caitlin Berggren's lovely essay called Life Cycle of a Common Weed. She's been living with hepatitis C for many decades now, and has pushed past against these rhetorics of war as they're applied to microbes. And so I think we'll see all sorts of improvisational practices in specific cultural locations that are responding to this, you know, some with joy. You know, we see in many parts of Europe, you know, people clapping for medical workers every night. Here on the streets of New York City, you see these amazing chalk drawings that people have made for essential workers, both by children and adults, just trying to show with graphic art like appreciation. So I think we're in a moment not just of paranoia and social isolation, but, you know, a real sense of collective entanglement. We see all sorts of emergent mutual aid networks. So you know, I think in many ways, you know, it's a precarious moment for humanity. It's a precarious moment for people who cannot afford masks, who cannot afford gloves, who, you know, might not be able to get regular access to water or soap. But it's also a collective moment of solidarity where people are appreciating with other people, like we're in this together. But I think, you know, for animals that share our vulnerability, whether it's on a molecular level because they have ACE2 receptors that are like ours, or, you know, like you could get caught in the crosshairs of, you know, like a collective biophobic freakout. So yeah, I think the cultural work can be done at that intersection between, you know, biophobia and biophilia, and this is part of the work I'm trying to do.
That was really beautiful, Eben, and I think a perfect way to end. And I think, yeah, caught in the crosshairs of biophobia would be anyone in the supermarket aisles trying to get some toilet paper a few weeks ago in Australia and other places. Luckily, I can report the toilet paper aisle is calm. We have calmed down about that, and yeah, I wonder if people will continue to ferment their love of kombucha and sourdough as something that we can keep going ahead with. So I want to thank you for sharing your thoughts and ideas. I want to share my screen for a moment to bring you, everyone watching, a picture of next week. So next week we will be talking to Ruha Benjamin, who is a professor of African American Studies and Anthropology, I believe, at Princeton University, where Eben is currently affiliated as well. And it's going to be a little bit different to the formats that we've had so far. There are two pre-recorded videos, one related to Ruha's amazing book, Race After Technology, and that is the one on the right there on the screen, Are Robots Racist? So there's about a half an hour talk there. And certainly, even though it was not written at all with pandemics in mind, it certainly is really important as we speak, as we see the increase of surveillance and of technological tools for contact tracing and for reducing the pandemic. But she's also been thinking about the current moment, and we have another video, the second one, Black Skin, White Masks, Racism, Vulnerability and Refuting Black Pathology, or How We Survive. And that is also about half an hour. So if you would like to participate, please watch both of those for sometime between now and next week, and then you can participate in a live Q&A. We've got limited spots to actually be on the Zoom participating in that, but they may or may not have already been filled up, but you are very welcome to, as you have today, listen on the YouTube stream and ask questions through the chat function there. So that will be another wonderful seminar. And we have coming up Monique McMahon, Frederick Keck and Ian Ang as well. So we'll release details of those future seminars very soon. So for now, thank you so much, Eben, for your time, our morning, your night.
Yeah, and thanks for organizing this amazing series.
Oh, it's great. Okay, see everyone next week. Keep safe. Wash your hands.
Bye.
Bye.